Hi, Maria. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
This is going to be exciting because I feel like I have known of you and known like the peripheral of your story forever. And I'm excited to sort of like get the firsthand account. So Bo, who we both know and love and who's been on the podcast before for Rolling Fun, and you have worked together for a really long time on Orbis, and I'm very excited to sort of like get your story from you from the beginning. So tell us sort of who you are, where you came from, and how you ended up starting to become the CEO of Orbis.
Sure. So Maria Flynn, I started off life as an engineer and then found that I'm more interested in the business side of technology. So I got to know Bo at Cerner, and we would have lunch and share stories.
Okay.
So I would help him with things and he would help me with things.
Did you work on the same team or anything, or you just kind of...
No, we were both in different leadership programs.
Okay.
And I was coming out of University of Chicago MBA, and he was going to go into HBS MBA. And so that's where we would start to share stories of, he would tell me how Cerner worked, and I would tell him what an MBA was like. And so we stayed friends, and then he went to Harvard and came back. And I was interested in doing something really entrepreneurial. But Cerner was a very important place to work, and it's a hard place to leave at that time.
Yeah.
And so I left not knowing what I was going to do. And Bo's door was one of the first ones I knocked on, because being at Kauffman Foundation, I knew he saw a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, he's like the intersection you go to, and you're like, I'm not sure what to do with my life or my company. I feel like he just gets so many of those phone calls.
Yes, yeah. He's a great person to talk with.
Yeah.
So little did I know what would that call would lead into.
Yeah.
And so as a few months, I was just exploring, seeing what was around town, what new things were starting. And it was the same time Corey and Bo were bringing the technology out of University of Illinois. So they had already founded the company, Orbis Biosciences. It took them about a year to get the license out and get some angel funding. And then they got me, and I was the first full-time person. So.
Yeah. And you were hired as CEO at that point?
No, at that point I was vice president of business development.
Okay.
So I would go see who could we get to partner with us. So it's very much a partnering story.
Yeah.
And that's what I was doing a lot at Cerner. So it was a good fit. And I think that's really important for technology coming out of universities, that you have a full-time person that's what they get up and think about all the time.
Yeah. What about Orbis made it? Is that an industry thing? Is that a company thing? Like, what made partnerships drive this company so much?
So it's a licensing business model.
Okay.
So we had a platform technology that could improve their drugs.
Okay.
And so we'd partner with pharmaceutical and consumer product companies.
Okay. So yeah, so no partners, no customers.
Right.
Like, really is.
Right.
Okay. Interesting. Were you, how involved were you in the like tech transfer process? That's a little bit of like a interesting mystery to me. Do you want to speak to that at all, or you kind of came after that, so that's not a...
So I came after it, but I managed it. And,
okay.
And so, when you start things, things are always going to be easier and take less time than when you start.
Yeah.
And so you do really want to have a good relationship with that party, and because they are the original owners.
Yeah.
And so if you need to make adjustments to the plan, that they come along with you, and they need you to succeed. Otherwise, that's not valuable to them.
So is they, in this case, the professor, the university, like what's the, because there's a bunch of counterparties over there, right?
Yeah. So that was it. So University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign,
Okay.
and Corey was the inventor. It was his PhD work, and he had went on to University of Kansas. So
Okay.
a lot of times when you're doing tech transfer, you're still a part of it.
Yeah.
And you get, typically there's favorable terms because they do want their innovation to be commercialized. So this was another party. But we had a good relationship, and, when we won, they won, but just keeping that going.
They, the university?
Right.
Okay. So the university owns a share of the company by nature of the fact that they own the IP where Corey developed it, even though he had then moved on.
Right.
Right. And so does he become like I don't know, I'm going to say CTO for lack of a better term. Is he like a part of a full-time role player at the company?
So he's chief scientific officer.
Okay.
But, he had a good day job at KU.
Yeah.
At University of Kansas, and Bo had a great day job at
Kauffman.
Kauffman.
Yeah.
So that's why, having me come in
Yeah.
and run with it, then I could come back to both of them and like, this is what I found. This is what, so that was a great structure to start.
Yeah. So they were like part-time founders. And so when you say you were the first full-time team member, you mean inclusive of the founding team, really.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. Was that a tough role?
It was an exciting role because, what can it be? It was more tough environment. So it was end of 2008. And that's where grants became really important to us because, so it was a $500,000 angel round.
Okay.
First 250, and then we needed to get 4 contracts to get the second tranche of 250. So we were very
contract motivated.
Yes.
Focused on those KPIs.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And we got those really quickly because
Wow.
we were, had this urgency. But we knew that money needed to last us as long as possible with the way the economy was.
Is the nature of those contracts that they cash flow right away? Or are you sort of saying like, oh, this is a licensing agreement that'll take a while to implement and then we get sort of payment on some terms over the long run? So it's like this will pay off eventually, but we still need a bunch of cash to operate in the meantime?
So our structure was, can we cover our costs in a proof of concept arrangement? So we would start with anything between 50 and 300,000, anything between 3 months and a year. So we would take the pharmaceutical company's product into our lab and apply our technology and see what we could do and if we could hit proof points. And then the licensing agreement comes later, and those are much more lucrative, but you need to have a lot of proof that it's worth it. Yeah,
because they go, I mean, they're making huge investments in implementing all this, and I'm sure these are enormous sort of scale processes. Well, I think we skipped over what the technology fundamentally is.
Yes. So it's a microparticle technology that very uniform spheres and capsules, so you can control how the active ingredient releases out of it. So a lot of times when you first take a medicine, there's kind of a burst, and kind of a release profile that is not as well controlled as we could control because the particle is very precise and all of them were the same.
Of the sort of the capsule that the medicine comes in specifically?
Well, no. So it's a powder format that you could then put in a syrup or a tablet or a capsule or a thin film or an injectable. So
you didn't necessarily, if you looked at 2 pills or capsules next to each other, you wouldn't know which is the Orbis one, but you'd be able to see in sort of the pace of the drug hitting the bloodstream, like which. Right. Okay.
So I can give you a couple examples.
Please.
So a lot of times controlled releases in like a bigger tablet form. And there was a product I would always take, but it was too strong for me. So I would cut it and it says, don't cut until it was really releasing quickly. So before I got into the space, I understood what I was doing, but it's very difficult to do it in a liquid format. So you get a 4-hour liquid and a 12-hour tablet. Well, you could use our technology to do a 12-hour liquid.
Interesting.
Or an injectable in a contraceptive space that, very potent drug, and you could release it out over a year. So you think of going in for an annual exam, getting a shot, it releases for a year. So those were a couple of our licenses.
That's awesome. Yeah, I imagine. I mean, people trying to sort of self-administer that could be dangerous in a bunch of ways. Like if you're cutting a pill, you're changing your dosage.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And what was Corey's like discovery or method, or like what was the breakthrough that enabled that?
So his hypothesis was, could you have very uniform microspheres to really control how it would release? And it was originally for an injectable depot, so long-acting pain relief.
Yeah.
And then when we started, we realized, it could be used for many things, and we had clients in gum and agrochemical and wound healing. Yeah. So a lot of different spaces. And we learned that, it was too big of an ask for a small team to know all those industries and our technology, but it helped us get those initial contracts that we needed. Yeah. And we learned a lot. So we learned stuff in gum that really transformed how we thought about oral drugs. So it was interesting. Sometimes you make these decisions out of necessity because you need to. But you learn things, and so it was always a fine balance of, enough balls in the air that something was going to cross the finish line, but few enough balls in the air that we were going to cross the finish line.
Yeah, that's a tension I see in a lot of startups is like, the need to focus on, because you're a small team, limited resources, but also, oh shit, we have so many market opportunities, so many applications for this technology. We've got customers maybe coming in from a bunch of different industries, but they all want something slightly different. I think it's a tough thing to manage, to know, when to focus down incredibly hard and when to explore new opportunities, because there's a local maximum over here, or, a bigger opportunity in this other market. So it sounds like you balance that a little bit with like, necessity of contract, exploration of market, but you eventually did focus back down on just the drug market. Were those tough decisions to make, or?
No, there's always the shiny object syndrome and how to, prevent yourself from getting off track. But, to me, it's a balance of, listening for the right signals of where to go next, but kind of staying true to where you're supposed to go, and the steadiness of keeping the train going. But a lot of times it's easy to stand on the outside and think you should know what people should do, but there's a lot of competing factors, and one of them is, cash to keep things going.
Yes. Yeah. So let's go back to that, sort of that early, you had $250,000 seed funding. You had another tranche of $250,000 coming. If you got the 4 contracts, that's, do you remember how many months of burn that was?
Oh, well, so at that time it was me.
Okay.
But that first check, $250 comes in, you feel like, oh, that's great, but you need to pay Illinois.
Yep.
So, because one of the main reasons universities will want to have these license agreements, because can they recoup some of their costs of
developing
the patents and their programs. And
so they want cash right away.
Yeah, so there'll be cash components.
That's pretty aggressive.
And, it all depends on what you negotiate. But ours had a significant one, and it had minimums along the way, so that there would be something. And really to show that we were doing something with it. Mm-hmm. So if we weren't, you don't want it on the shelf somewhere. Yeah. If we weren't, it would go back to the university. But, we had cash components, and they had an equity component.
Sure.
And then they had a share of licenses. Yeah. So there are a couple elements.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, that just feels like a risky thing. I don't know. Like, I understand they've got immediate cash lay, they've got to recoup, but pulling cash out of a startup that just raised $250,000 feels like a heavy burden.
Also legal fees. So the organizational setup and that. So we had 2 significant checks go.
Yeah.
But then how we structured it was when we signed deals, we would outsource it to the university lab. So we had an arrangement where they wouldn't retain IP. It was a services agreement. Yeah. But that's how we could get started very small.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So what was the process of like running down those first 4 contracts? Did you start super broad?
So we would go to conferences. Yeah. And one of our most important relationships we found at the world's best technology conference in Texas. And so there was, wherever there were technology scouts.
Is it just called the World's Best Technology Conference?
World Best Technology.
Is it the World's Best Technology Conference?
You wouldn't have felt like it when you were there, like anything big was going to come out of it.
Yeah.
But a significant relationship did come out of it.
That's awesome.
There are these challenges, 9 Sigma and Innocentive, where companies would put out, some kind of technology need, and we would respond to those. Okay. And that was pretty positive. A lot of companies would come through University of Kansas, and so it was a nice magnet of they want to see what's happening there. Yeah. And so we had a variety, and actually through our website, people would find us. So we had a few market channels.
Just some good scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
Just were those first 4 in different industries?
Yes.
Okay. So learning a lot about a broad set of market opportunities.
Right.
And then you got your second tranche. Where did the grant funding sort of start to enter the picture? I know that's and you're getting cash from each of these contracts, so you got a few different sources. Was it after that second tranche of seed funding that?
We started working on the process before, but it was actually, so it takes a while to get a grant, and we had gotten the signal that we were in queue for it to be coming, but it wasn't there yet. So we actually raised a small bridge convertible note, which it ended up we didn't need it, but we thought we were going to run out of that 500 before that kicked in.
Yeah.
So we had started the process, and when people come to me and they need money now, this isn't a great mechanism for now, but it's a great mechanism for 6 to 9 months from now.
Yeah, I've seen a few times sort of the small fundraise to bridge to a slow cash flow that's coming either from a big customer or a grant or something, and it's scary to wire 2 months of money into a company, but that can go good or bad, sort of either way. I know this is now sort of the focus of your career is consulting on grants, getting grants, and positioning companies for acquisition, because these are both things that Orbis went through and that you learned a ton about. So I want to sort of learn as much as we can about the grant funding process, because who does not want non-dilutive equity or non-dilutive capital, right? I think it's scary and hard and slow, but man, if you get it, like, that just feels like the cat's pajamas.
Yep.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, and actually, I've got investor friends that are bringing their companies to me because they put some in, but if they can get extra, why not?
Yeah, hell yeah. I mean, yeah. The best case scenario is like you're an early equity investor, and then there's a bunch of non-dilutive funding that comes after, and then the company sells or goes public or starts cash flowing, and you didn't have to get diluted by follow-on investors who push you down or took better liquidity preferences or anything. So yeah, tell us everything.
So I came in August of 2008, and it was probably a month later I was in a room where it was, how to fund your startup. Okay. It was a couple hour, different speakers, and there was a lunch, and there were maybe 20 companies, 20 entrepreneurs in the room. And it was heavy in angel and VC, mostly venture capital, is as how the conversation typically goes. And a woman raised her hand and said, why aren't we talking about small business innovation research, SBIR grants? And, the speaker didn't really know that space and said, well, it's not applicable to all companies, but if you can do it, then go get it. And kind of patted her on the head. And I thought, I want to know what she knows. and so I went up to her later, and her name is Donna Johnson with Pinnacle Technologies in Lawrence, Kansas. And she was a great mentor for me. So she, gave me some of her feedback. They were successful in getting grants, and she actually had some inside baseball knowledge because she had sat on the other side and giving grants. And so she gave me some tips and pointed me to some websites. And so that was a super important day, meeting her, because having somebody that has done it before you know some of those tricks, and you don't want to scare people off by saying, will you mentor me? Because that sounds like a lot of time. But if, can I follow up with some questions? Most everybody will say sure. So I got, one day I went over to her office and she showed me some things. And one of the tips she told me was, specific aims. So we're going to cut that part, right? So one of the things she told me about was your specific aims. It's a 1-page kind of summary of what your application is going to be. And she said, develop that, and then NIH will go around the country and meet with entrepreneurs. National Institutes of Health.
Okay.
So there are 12 federal agencies that will fund SBIRs. There's over $3 billion every year that goes to small business innovation research, SBIRs. And there's 2 acronyms. There's SBIR and there's STTR, which is Small Business Tech Transfer. And really the difference is how much of that award can go into a university or go outside the small business. So those are the 2 mechanisms that the government gives to small business. They've been doing this for 40 years. Every few years, there's a concern that it won't be renewed. Will it die? But it's been going on for a long time, and really, it's to stimulate small business innovation in our country. So it's a nice pile of money. And but it's kind of a game of how to get to it.
How do you know? Even a range of like how many small businesses that goes to, or what size sort of the grants? I mean, $3 billion is a lot, but if that goes to a small handful of companies.
So a phase 1 is typically around 225.
Okay.
And a phase 2 is typically around $1.5 million. And it varies by agency. Like I think USDA capped it at $1 million for a phase 2, but so in a couple hundred for phase 1, and so that's a lot of grants.
That's a lot of grants. I mean, that's a seed round,
right?
Like instantly, and $3 billion is a lot of those.
Right. It is a competitive process,
Yeah.
and that varies by agency, but typically 20-25% are awarded. So you think about how many there are, and then
I mean, that's
4 or 5x that of how many's going for it.
It's a better odds than individual investor outreach. Certainly, I don't know about sort of in aggregate. It depends, what your sample size is. But 20-25% is higher than I would have guessed, actually.
Well, and you think about how much time you spend in the investor trail and how many doors you knock on, and in the due diligence process. And so when I see, our rates, particularly around our states, are not as high for SBIRs, and so when I drill down of why is that, it can be an intimidating process that takes a lot of time, but raising money is an intimidating process that takes a lot of time. So
it's a little less sexy to get a grant from the government, but it shouldn't be, because it's way better economics.
Right. So I've a good story on that.
Yeah.
So let's go back to, if we could, the road show, the National Institutes of Health would go around, and there was one in Omaha, and so we went there. I had my specific aims page, and I was going to go for the phase 1 $225,000, and she turns around and she pulls out a page, and I said, well, I think you'd be a great candidate for this lab to marketplace grant. And phase 1 was $800,000, and phase 2 was $1.8 million.
Okay.
And so this was our first grant, and I was like, okay, well, let's go for that. And that was our first award, was $800,000.
Wow.
And so I went into Kauffman Foundation, and Bo and I were celebrating.
Yeah.
And somebody walks by that's a mentor that I have a lot of respect for, and Bo says, hey, we just got $800,000 grant. And the mentor says, well, a grant does not a company make. So I think there's a bias against grants that you can kind of poo-poo that, whereas if it was like an investor, we wouldn't have that same reaction.
There's a little more. Is the understanding that there's more signal in an investor buying in because it's?
I think that's right, but I think that's misplaced, because if you look at the review panels that that stand behind these grants, there's a long list of people, and they're from academia and industry, and they have deep knowledge in this space. Mm-hmm. Whereas you look at the investors, how, it's not always that they have deep knowledge in that space.
Yeah.
So I think we do see a lot more signal if you can get an investor to write a check, but I don't think that's accurate.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Because I think investors with definitely some exceptions tend to be more broad, more generalists rather than, and I imagine that the review process is a little bit of a black box to most people. They don't know, they don't dig in to see like who is the panel that's actually approving this and reviewing the technologies, and I'm sure it's a bit of a burdensome process, but it should, I think it's an interesting point that should carry a lot more credibility than it seems to.
Right. And then you think about, and where he's going is, you do want to be careful from an academic perspective. You get these grants, and then if it doesn't work, it's okay, you go get another grant. And that doesn't work in a startup. So that's the difference, is like you are leveraging this investment that the government's making to get you to the next stage, just like you would any other investor. And it can't be a rationale of like, if it doesn't work, I'll go get another grant. It has to work. So
you get, talk about that sort of that journey. Like, if you get a phase 1 grant, does that mean you cannot go get another phase 1 grant? Does that mean you either proceed to 2 or fail? Do you go back to VCs after that? Like, it's a great option. But I guess what makes it so that you can't sort of try to continue to live on after that.
Well, and so you've got a nice window in the beginning where,
especially 800 grand gets a long way.
Yeah. And you are new and it's innovation.
Yeah.
And that's what I work with my entrepreneurs is you want a grant program. What are all the doors you can walk through and map that out and walk through all those doors. Don't just walk through one door and if it gets stuck, then go through another door. Yeah. Because like the Department of Defense has many interests and a lot of them overlap with other agencies. So oftentimes, particularly if you have a platform technology, like there's a lot of things you can do with it. But looking at what you want to develop and chunking it into stages that are 225 million and a half, whatever. But it's also key that you're chunking into things that you should be doing and you want to be doing, and you don't get sidetracked of like, oh, well, this is money, but you're working on something that's not propelling you to where you need to go. So it's a balance of, the things you need to do to propel your company and what is interesting to those agencies.
Yeah, because those grants are not revenue. They're just cash, right? And so you still need to, you simultaneously build the function and the plan that gets you the capital, but be building the company, the customer-facing company and sales channels and partnerships that you need to actually keep the company to stand on its own later. And it's nice that you can get sort of a series or potentially, the analogy that is in my head that just sort of popped up is like scholarships. It's like people can get multiple overlapping scholarships. Some of them have requirements, some of them don't, some of them care that you're overlapping them, some of them don't, but like at the end of the day, it's better than a student loan economically. And if people can like help you along, they want to, that's what the money's there for. The money's there to like help you grow and move you along and build exactly the kind of business that the government knows will create jobs and foster innovation. So talk about, I guess, some of the process going into it. Like when did you said you met Donna Johnson, you attended a conference, you're like sort of seeing where these are, these sources of money. How hard was the process of like learning to apply? Because I think as you said, it's intimidating. It's a little bit of a black box. It's a weird skill set. It's a lot of paperwork. So talk about sort of the learning curve around getting up to speed on these.
Well, and your first time with anything, you're learning new, you don't have bio sketches and, the things that but you're selling yourself. So a lot of the stuff that you do in the process, you should be doing anyway. There's a competitive section and you should know that. Yeah. So that's the other way of thinking about it. It's not even if we don't get the award, it's not time wasted because it's stuff you should be doing. And if you think of it in that mindset and don't get too bogged down into it. But your first time,
you're not like, oh, this is more paperwork.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But your first time you're assembling all those pieces and you're learning, and you open up the application guide and it's almost 400 pages. And I think that's why a lot of people who can use this mechanism aren't using it is because it becomes a little overwhelming, which is what I'm here to help them through. But the first question to answer is if you're eligible.
Okay.
And so we'll get you that link. And so there are a couple keys. So it needs to be a small business, which means it's under 500 people.
Oh, okay. Check.
Yeah. It needs to be owned by U.S. Okay. And sometimes there'll be people I'll meet that are a great candidate for that, but they might not have U.S. citizenship. So it needs to
be owned by U.S. citizens.
Right.
Okay.
It can have some venture capital in it. That's something that came in new in the last 10 years. Before you couldn't. Yep. But there are certain, percentages.
Sorry, before, not to get you off track, it needs to be owned in whole or in part by U.S. citizens.
Well, and there's a whole matrix on that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure there's 5 pages on that alone.
Yeah. But it's really, is it defined as a small business? Ownership and control, and who owns it, and are they U.S. and size, the 500. And then the other key thing is your principal investigator or your PI needs to be 51% in the business. So that's where a lot of university folks will have a problem because they can't be in 2 places at once, which is where I came in.
The principal investigator meaning like the main operator of the business?
Well, the main, principal investigator, or your PI, needs to be 51% in the business. So that's where a lot of university folks will have a problem because they can't be in 2 places at once, which is where I came in. The principal investigator meaning like the main operator of the business? Well, the main the main person running the grant.
Okay. I had not heard that term before.
Yeah.
Principal investigator. That's a badass term.
PI, yeah.
Yeah.
And, I don't have a PhD. I have an engineering background. I can certainly understand technology. But a lot of the times when you look at who the PIs are, they do have, a PhD and, rich credentials. And so I'm the PI on our first one. And then after that, we had PhDs. So I share that because don't let it stop you, because we made it through that on the first one.
Interesting. So what was is there no credential around the technology itself, or does that sort of live somewhere else in the document?
Oh, yes. So it's deep in there. And you will be competing with a lot of, important things and a lot of people who really know the space intimately. So it does have to, be significant.
And what are some of the things that you see often as like the technologies that are coming up? So it is interesting. This is mostly tech driven. There's a split between tech transfer, so stuff coming out of academia, and maybe stuff that's totally independent of academia. Although I imagine most of this is academic research that's starting to become commercialized.
Or no, I do work with people who are developing their own innovation. It's more of does that agency or institute or whoever has the pot of money, is it what you're building aligned with what they want to see out there? Yeah. And a lot of times they will put out, these are research areas we want to fund. Mm-hmm. But then they also have what they call general omnibus, which is, bring all your ideas, which is what all of ours were funded under. So even if you can't find the specific one to go for, they will entertain a lot, as long as you fit into their mission and there's a commercial need and it's real. And
you're solving a problem that they have and see in their field. Okay, so you said that $3 billion of that money goes in, and the umbrella term is SBIR or STTR.
Right.
Okay, but they're actually the individual decisions or the allocations are made by one of 12 different agencies, I think you said?
Yeah, so there are 12 agencies, and then if you look, like the Department of Defense has 12, 14 within it. Okay. There's the Department of Health and Human Services, which NIH is a big bulk of that. But there's also FDA and CDC. So I'll get you this link.
Just acronyms and acronyms and acronyms and acronyms. Yeah, we'll put a few of the links sort of in the show notes here, or people can look them up. And Maria's website, I'm sure, has a ton of the sort of posts and stuff breaking this down. So does that mean you're submitting to potentially a dozen individual applications? Like, does each organization runs their own process, even though the pot of money is the same?
Right. And you want to find the specific place for that grant to go. Okay. And that's one of the tricks you learn. After you submit it, you got to make sure it went to the right place, because we had time when we didn't do that, and it went to a different review committee who wouldn't have gotten what we were doing. So it was kind of a waste of a submission.
Interesting.
And you want to talk to the program officer before, manager before, saying this, going back to your one page, this is what we want to do. Does this fit? Yeah. And I do talk with companies that will go there, and they'll say, no. So then they'll save some time.
Yeah. So you don't even have to apply. Yeah. Okay.
But if you are just at all in their wheelhouse, they will encourage you, because it's a bit like universities where, the more applicants you get, the smaller award percentage, the more prestigious it is. So there is some of that. And it all depends program manager to program manager, but they can give you some really good feedback of, what are the kinds of things that they're talking about, what they're interested in.
So that's kind of where you plant the seed or foster a relationship with the decision makers and sort of try to. So is that what's your sense of how many of these are just like straight thrown over a counter and, out of 100, the top 20 get funded, versus like there's like a lobbying sort of like process that's going on and relationships determine this? Like, is it?
I think it's more merit-based from my experience of, what are the what does the review committee think are the best ones that cycle. But I have heard stories where there's a need they have, and because they know these people, they will call them up and say, hey, we really need this, and you're well suited.
Please submit.
Right.
Yeah.
So it does. It is worthwhile having those relationships, but I don't think it gets you to the top of the list.
Yeah, and even that, there's multiple iterations, and it still needs to be, whatever it is, still needs to go to market.
Right.
Are these? How often is the relationship of like grant funding and becoming a customer? Like, how often are those interrelated? I mean, the motivation for these agencies to be giving you the money is to make this technology available for them to purchase, right? So how often is that the same conversation? Is that a totally sort of like firewall separated conversation?
So for the U.S. government to be a client, is that?
Yeah. Or any of these agencies individually, right? Or is that, you think of it the same way?
Well, and like the National Institutes of Health, a lot of it is creating research to better, our health.
Sure.
And so they wouldn't be a client per se, but Department of Defense, I can see them becoming a client. And so the three agencies that we worked with are National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, and the USDA. Mm-hmm. And the DoD, it became a contract versus a grant. So we entered, our phase one was an SBIR, and then it became a contract. And so that's when you can see more of the grant shifting into a client relationship.
Yeah. Do you have a preference as a founder and operator, like whether it's revenue or grant?
There was a lot more requirements around a grant and a lot more auditing. So at the time it felt onerous, but it all makes you a better company. Yeah. And so then when you get to selling your company, if you've been audited by the DoD, you can be audited by anybody.
That's the DoD's motto.
Right.
If you can make it through our audit, you'll be fine for everything else that comes after. Interesting. Okay. How much? If we can play a game of conjecture, like how much of the funding came from equity investors and how much came from grant funding, and how might have the world of Orbis turned out differently if that pie chart was different?
So we knew we were a good grant story, and once we started it, we just kept going because it's really nice funding. I think it's healthier funding than traditional venture because
healthier financially.
Healthier in that you close your month. How much did you spend? You ask for that money. Whereas venture, you get this big pot, you got to spend it, and it's kind of feast and famine mode. And
Oh, so the grants are actually allocated sort of month by month based on your expenses up to a certain amount.
You only withdraw it after you've spent it.
Oh, interesting.
And there's another way to do it. To me, that's the easier, cleaner way.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of requirements, and that just...
Assuming you have the cash, some cash already to float all your expenses. Okay.
So it's a health, and it's reliable. It's there. So I think it's a pretty healthy way. So we had $9 million through SBIRs.
Wow. Over what time period?
Probably 6 years.
Wow. Okay.
And it was, so let's talk about what it did for us. Because I always felt a chicken and the egg problem where to really get customers interested or even investors interested, we needed to show these things and we needed money to show those things. Yeah. And that's what the SBIR grant filled. And so it helped us scale our technology from lab to a large skid. And it answered a lot of the questions that people had from a scale perspective. It helped us prove a couple different applications, so taste masking for pediatrics, inner ear therapies. It helped us get our first clinical trial and go to the FDA, and because there wasn't anything unusual in we were just a different way to make those particles, a better way. We weren't creating an extra FDA burden, but people would have that question mark, and we could go do that.
So you still needed FDA approval?
Well, of course, on the products, but we could go to the FDA and with our clinical trials and get that feedback. So then any client that came, they would have that as an example.
Yeah. Interesting. So $9 million's a lot. And so did you raise any venture in that once you started getting those grants?
No, and we tried later. I mean, quite a bit later, and then we had product ideas. And that was pretty challenging because, people want to fund things that are new. And once you've been around longer, that's a harder story to tell. They also, we were cash flow positive for a lot of years, which is hard for a startup to do. And that was just in the covering our cost phase. It was not in the license phase that came later. So, we had a much bigger financial story later, but I think people are worried that, you're in the covering the costs. So there were a couple of reasons why I think it was difficult for us to raise funding. But when it got to the end and we were selling the company, it turned out to be a blessing because we could be much more flexible on how we structured that. So sometimes when you have these difficulties and you're not crossing the finish line you want to cross, and then later on you can look back and be like, I'm glad I didn't cross that finish line because this would be much harder.
So not raising venture gave you the optionality to get acquired for what you wanted rather than what the other equity holders wanted, because you had fewer sort of stakeholders with different outcomes in mind. Interesting. So let's I mean, is there anything else to sort of tell about the grant piece of the story before we smash cut to the acquisition piece?
Let's see. So like if you click on this agencies and you go into the NIH, it says access $1.2 billion in small business funding from NIH's seed fund. So they view themselves as an investor. Okay. They're just seeding,
even though they're not taking
even though they're not taking equity. So and they're not breathing down your neck. You do. It's more of a financial, are you spending money the way you should be? But you do have your reports at the end that you submit, but it's not like you got to prepare for board meetings. Okay. And then the other thing to know is to look into your state incentives, because some states they call it phase 0. They will give you money to apply for these. And some states will match. I think about half of the states will match either phase 1 or phase 2. So if you go get one,
it could double.
Not quite double. They might do 50% or a certain percent up to, 150,000. But it's a multiplier effect. Yeah. And so to be aware of that.
Yeah, there's a ton of local even economic development agencies. I had some experience in college working with one in Lansing. That was there was the Michigan one and then the Lansing one, and it's there's some people that were kind of able to layer over and over different things. And the layer 0 is interesting too, because a few times I was thinking, man, it's a good thing you had that first $500,000, because you have to float cash and it takes time to get these grants and apply for them, and it's expensive, and you're traveling, you're spending time writing, doing more research. So let's talk a little about the timeline before we move on to how long does it take to prepare one of these, submit, wait on the answer, get the money. I imagine there's companies could live and die by that, and that I can't imagine it's a fast process.
Right. We would give ourselves about 3 months for one, and your first
for an application.
One, right.
Okay.
Because you're doing other things too.
Yeah.
And your first one, you want to give yourself a little buffer because you're learning things. Yeah. There's registrations. There's 4 registrations that you take a bit of time. I think they can take up to 6 weeks. Okay. And then it all depends on your agency. And so the most active ones are NIH and Department of Defense, and they have NIH for SBIR is 3 a year. Okay. So you can think
3
about
decision points.
Right. Okay. So January 5th is the next one, and then April 5th. And so they'll want to have their review cycle done before their next one submission, so they don't get deluged. And so you want to, after you submit it, you want to check it went to the right place. And then typically about, say, 6 weeks, you'll get some kind of a signal. The worst thing that can happen, the worst thing that can happen is you can be rejected for something like formatting, there will be those kind of stories, and I think people hear those stories and they're like, oh, no, not worth it. Yeah. But then if it gets reviewed, because they have so many to look through, the worst ones they won't score. So if it's not scored, then that's the worst one. And then you get a score and you will get a feedback sheet. Oh. And so typically 3 reviewers. The lower the score, the better you did. And then they'll have a pay line and that will fluctuate cycle by cycle.
It's kind of a force curve.
Right.
Okay.
But nothing is guaranteed until it's done. But once they start working with you on the next step, it's pretty much the funding's coming as long as you follow up with their requests.
Yeah.
So once you get that signal, then you can. So one story I have is we had 2 phase 1s going, and phase 1 grants, and we were applying for the phase 2 grants, and we didn't get them, and we're pretty down on it. Yeah. And then we had somebody leave our company, and we just had a lot going on, and this person would typically have helped us apply for those. So 2 of us got together and we were like, okay, let's take the feedback, let's make the changes that we can, but let's just resubmit it. And we got both of them. And they weren't that significantly different than the time before, because it was just so much going on. Like, we got this many hours to do it. Let's just go do it. Yeah. And so that just goes to, like, you never know. It all depends on, like, who are you up against? Who are your reviewers? Is there somebody in there that likes it enough to stand up for you? And what are their negotiation abilities? Yeah. Some people, just want to push it through because they can, or other people, maybe don't have that personality. So I think there's so many factors in there that it's just more of a numbers game. So at the end of the day, we got 79% of the funds we went after. Wow. And I think if you look at it, we had talented people in there, but it was really a keep going, last person standing mentality. Yeah.
Keep cash in the bank, keep resubmitting, wait till you find the right. Did I don't know if you remember this, maybe too detailed of a question, but like, how much did the pay line move? How much did your score move? Like, how many of these things are in your control to change? Because how many times does a funding come down to like a sentence in a deck with one sentence written this way and one sentence written this way, and who happens to read it, and it just locks in with their lived experience and how they've been thinking about something. And it's amazing how small changes can affect an outcome. But it also may be that they're like, we rewrote the whole thing based on feedback they gave us, and then we were up against a weaker cohort and our score moved up 10 or down 10 points. And like, how much do you feel like you can change, and how much is just like keep throwing darts?
I don't think a lot of it is in your control. I think you do your best. It's pretty much in anything. You put it out there, and you just see what happens. Okay. Because I think it's more of like, who does this resonate with? And what I've seen with other startups is sometimes the investors that have the deep knowledge in that space also have the baggage. Yeah. And so it's really the adjacent investors that will go with you.
Remain optimistic.
Because I talked with an investor, and they had a great outcome. They sold their company for $2 billion. And when I looked at how much went into, like, that had to be a great outcome. And then he said, I'd never do that again. and it's just because you've got all this scar tissue of how the ups and downs, when it still is a good outcome, but you have that stuff that you carry. Yeah.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I know too much to have started it again.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So talk a little bit about the process that you have, that you walk entrepreneurs through. If they reach out to you and they say, hey, we think we're eligible for some of these grants. We'd love some non-dilutive funding. We have a technology. We have an early team. And we could really use this money to keep going. How do you, over what timeline, sort of what do they tend to need the most help with?
So it's a 12-week program, and we start by kind of mapping out what are all the doors we can walk through, and what are all the areas you want to develop your technology. And then quickly you got to hone in on what you think is the best one to go first, based on what you need to do and what you think the agency would like. Yeah. And this assumes you've already, you already made all the requirements, and you're
somewhat prepared to put together a good application,
and you're able to apply, and then try to spread out the jobs in your team, so it's not so onerous on one person. You need one person driving the bus, but other people can carve off little chunks, particularly if you have like a technical person and a more commercial person. So we put together that plan of, what will that look like? You want to talk with the program manager early. First, you got to develop what your one page is of what you want to do. But that's really a good tool to take around because you want to get letters of support from people like buyers or experts in the industry. And you can make your team shinier by getting these friends that will come along with you and either as advisors or potential customers. And then, so getting the feedback from the program manager is really the fuel to like go do the rest of the work. Yeah. So there's a lot of,
if they're encouraging about what they see in you, then you're kind of like, okay, cool. Very interesting. How much should people anticipate to invest in that process, either in hours? They had told me, and what was pretty true, I think, is your first one takes about 100 hours. Oh. If you are efficient and ticking things off. And that's, sometimes when we get overwhelmed by there's so many things we have to do, I would always tell myself, perfect is the enemy of good. Yeah. You've got 4 hours to go do this section, whatever it is at the end of the section, I'm handing it to, my colleague who's going to review it or take the next step, and not letting things just get out of control. And I imagine if someone inventoried the process to raise $1 million seed round, it's probably not too far off.
No, it's just
and potentially more value in depending different structure, different feedback, different things. It's interesting to hear that there's so much feedback and the burden on you to write an excellent document, knowing that you can't be in the room when they're talking about your fate. I feel like is a whole different game, but I'm sure, you put your heart and soul on that page and do everything you can to sort of make an amazing case.
I think the difference is when you go raise venture, you don't pull up this application guide that has the 400 pages, and they say, it's not so visible how long it's going to be typically.
Yeah, you can trick yourself into thinking it's going to be a few hours at a time, few smaller iterations, I suppose. But yeah, that's a very different process. Okay. All right. One more. Anything else on the grant funding?
I don't think you can outsource it.
Interesting.
So I think a lot of times people will look for a grant writer to like, hey, go do this for me.
Yeah, there's agencies and stuff,
So a word on that. I had we had just started going for it because I had gotten the advice early on, like you can't outsource this, and I didn't truly believe it until we had gotten a $15,000 grant from the state of Kansas to go get help, and these groups had pitched us on the support, and so I was going to go with one of them, and then I was doing my reference checks, and I found a woman that said, well, yeah, they were okay, but I won't submit another application without using these people. And so then I started to look at those people and doing their reference checks, and really high, recommended highly. And so we worked with them, and it was one of our worst reviews, and it was a positive experience working with them, and they were great to work with. But at the end of the day, the result wasn't. So that just goes to show, like, it's a very difficult to control process. Yeah. But I do see, like, because a lot of times these are very technical things you're doing, and you can find technical writers for sure. But you spend more time communicating it to them, and then coming back, like, invest in Grammarly. Just get in there and writing skills vary person to person, and so you can get somebody to help you with it, but you can't just outsource it to somebody.
And, you don't want someone else driving the bus,
right?
Which I think is the interesting. I think that's why your approach is really smart, because it isn't very much. You're not saying you can't get help. You're saying you can't outsource the driving of the bus. Right. You like the driving has to be internal inside the company. It matters more to you than anybody else. You've got to own it. But having a mentor can help a lot. Having a writer can help a lot. Having letters of support or expert reviews or program managers, so like feedback and contribution from a ton of people, yourself possibly highly recommended by me.
Thank you.
For helping with this process, and having an expert I think helps a lot, because I can't imagine the gut punch of putting 100 hours into something and then being rejected for formatting.
Right. Well, and that's where I think you have to look at it like, whatever comes of this, my company's gonna grow, and I'm gonna take these sections to whatever the next thing is, because you're talking about the significance of why this is important and the commercialization impact, and like, so you have to look at it as like, I'm gonna get something out of this regardless.
Yeah. Refining my story,
but hopefully some money too.
Building an asset. Yeah, amazing. Okay. All right. What else on? I mean, is the acquisition stuff like? Do you pair those together with you sort of consult with people on getting grant funding and managing that process? You also consult on you call it acquisition coaching,
right?
Like how to position yourself for acquisition, or what that process is like, or how to set up for success there. How often are those like overlapping, and you do them together with the same companies, or these are kind of separate offerings that you have just expertise in both?
Yeah, they're separate, and it's I really like working with entrepreneurs. That's my tribe.
Yeah,
and I feel like I've got experience that can help them.
Yeah,
and kind of 90-day marches up the mountain of like, where do you want to be in 90 days and how can we get there? And I'm modeling it after, my mentor that I had, Terry, Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock, every week, was a great urgency builder to drive forward. Cause I'd be like, I'm going to talk with Terry. I want to get this done. I want to be able to talk about this.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like he was going to hold my feet to the fire. But it's a helpful mechanism for me. So that's what I want to be for entrepreneurs of, every week, how are we making progress?
Yeah.
And, but when I looked back at what we did well, grant funding was, when you go and look at our numbers, like, we did that well. And then also what I really wanted was vision into that sale. And so that experience, we learned a lot, and I see that missing as the education and expertise, and really it's a lot of business development of how do you prepare for the sale.
Yeah.
And so that's an 8-week structured, these are the things you need to be doing, these are the ducks you need to get in a row, these are the people you should be meeting. And it's really before, you can think there's, business brokers and investment bankers, but this is really before that, and really getting control of your destiny by getting to know those people that would be potential buyers.
Yeah, I think that's, a lot of entrepreneurs hope to be acquired or aim to be acquired, but there's very few that you meet that actually have a specific plan. And it's kind of like, oh, we're going to get acquired, and then what's the strategy for getting acquired? It's like, oh, we don't have a strategy for it. We just hope it works. Hope is not a strategy.
Right.
So, it's how many of those do you think are in that sort of 8-week program? How many are, let's say, like hard skills versus or to-dos versus soft? How many of them are like, you need, this kind of reporting that you're not doing, or this or this or this, and how many are you want to tell this story, meet these people, position your company this way?
So I think you could put structure, and this is where the engineering mind, the structure seeker, into a lot of those things, just even by putting it into a list. So when you think about at the end, what's your target list of companies? Because we had we started building that list, 10 years before we were acquired, and, and starting to get to know. So, our acquirer we had known for a long time, and which are the companies that we really resonate with and we really fit well. There were many companies that technology would have fit in. And it was one epiphany. It was, investment bankers are great people to know because they've got a lot of information that's hard to get.
Yeah.
And they know a lot of things. And one advice I got was, you haven't even been to this conference it's called CPHI, this conference in Europe, and it's 40,000 people. And so when you go over there, you're like, oh my gosh, there's all these acquirers too. And we had certainly been global with our customers, but going there was like, oh my gosh, this whole hall, we could fit in this whole hall. And then the last time I went, there was another hall with like more on the ingredients side that we started to have conversations with, like, we could be in this hall too. Yeah. So really, like, what's the world of possibilities of where you fit, but then also having an understanding of like which are the most likely. And so when I talk with my entrepreneur friends, we'd have this debate of like, do you need an investment banker or not? Yeah. And the page that I had found is like, is your world of possibilities of where you fit, is it 5 or less? Then you probably don't. Is it 20 or more? Then you probably do. And if you're in the middle, it's kind of a gray area. But like, how many of those people do you already know? And you should be doing that a long time before you start a process. And then really, what is the trigger that will start your process? Yeah. Because companies are bought, they are not sold. So it's more about the buyer's situation and, what is the pain point they need? Do they have some money that they need to put somewhere? Do they, do they need to show innovation? Do they need to get a new client base? Like, what is their pain point? And then if you can search for that trigger and then already know the other people you're going to call when that happens. Yeah. And then there's things like taxes, but you can shift things to charitable trust, but you need to do that 12 months before an event, so you can learn things through friends. Yeah. But it takes a lot of work. How do you streamline that? And a lot of times it's the first time we've ever done this. Yeah. So how do you, learn before you're there?
Yeah, you don't want to find out you painted yourself into a corner of a 6-figure tax bill and there's no way out. Right. That's an expensive lesson to learn the hard way one time. So did you know when you started at this company that, this is a licensing business model, we have a technology, the only way out is acquisition, so let's plan for it 10 years in advance?
Yeah, except we thought it was going to be 3 to 5 years.
Classic.
And it was 12 years. Yeah.
Okay. So how did you, you talked a little bit about, you've got you know the targets, you start relationships with them early. What turned out to be the trigger for the acquisition?
Because we had actually ran a process before we got to know, we had an investment banker and got to know a lot of people. And we did get a letter of interest. But what was more significant about that time period is we got license agreement done because they wanted to negotiate with us and not with an unknown buyer. So it was worth doing, but it was another one at the time when it doesn't turn out exactly how you had hoped. You're like, oh, and you pick it up and you keep going. But then a couple of years later,
what year was that? Sort of you ran a process but ended up not selling.
I think that was 2017.
2017. Okay.
And then I think that was early in 2017, and then late in 2018, we had the target list and what, I think a lot of times when there is turnover within companies at the management level, like what are their new directives? And so when in the company, they had brought somebody in to go find new technologies. Okay. And he had mentioned us. So we were already on his radar. So that was like now's the time.
So I really like the line, companies are bought, they're not sold. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting how quickly things can change on your potential acquirer's side of, a strategic initiative, a management turnover, cash infusion. So just being at the right place at the right time, and just like the grant funding, so staying in the game, right. Increasing your shots on goal, which I guess comes down to your engineer mindset of like, you put it on the list, you maximize your exposure to good events, and you stay in the game.
Yep. Stay alive. Yep.
Stay alive. And then, so once you got that, what was the sort of more step-by-step piece of that process? So your acquirer got interested, sort of started a conversation with you about this, and then, did you restart the more grand process with investment bankers? Did you shop that offer? Did you?
No, we couldn't shop the offer, and a lot of times you can't. Okay. So once you're there, you need to decide, are you taking it or not? Yeah. And which is why preparation is key. Mm-hmm. because a lot of people will just say, go get 2 more. But it's all about your options, obviously,
Yeah.
and what you can do if this doesn't go through. And so we did re-engage the banker.
Okay.
And it was important, I was a female in a very male-dominated space. The acquirer, the entire management team was male. So I felt like that helped us and gave us just more experience.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to go through, something that you have never been through before when the other side of the table does it, 10 times a year.
Right.
You do it once in your life.
Right.
So, yeah, which is, again, why the acquisition sort of coaching and mentorship. And some people are lucky to have, board members like Bo, who have
Right.
been through acquisitions before
sure.
and sort of can take some of those phone calls and at least be oriented to the process. But not everybody does. And
Right.
that's a good, is where the value of some of that board and investor experience can really come into, which is, I'm sure, what VCs would say when they're pitching for against grant funding.
Right.
Like, no, take my money. You need my expertise.
Right, for sure.
And it's nice to know that there's people like you who kind of freelance this expertise, who can come in and help companies regardless of what else is going on. How can other founders, what is like sort of common advice you give them to position themselves for a sale?
Well, you need to know where you fit and how other people need you and what you have that they need.
Yeah.
And so really understanding, it's just another customer of like, what is their pain and how do you solve it? And then it's all timing. Right.
Yeah. Timing. So just being able to, having the agency to stay alive until
right.
you're acquired.
And timing is so important and some deals get done in 90 days, some take 18 months.
Yeah.
And one of the things our board would say was, time kills all deals.
Mm-hmm.
And it was originally going to close March 31st of 20. And we got the call the week before with the pandemic environment that, it was going to be pushed a month. And so that was just really ringing in my head. Time kills all deals, but you think about like the dot-com bubble burst where prior to March 10th, the IPO of your dreams, afterwards, bankruptcy. So like so many of these things, it's a win one day and it's not the next. So, keeping your company, obviously you build your company to be as good as it can be and stand on its own for as long as it can. But there's also the begin with the end in mind aspect because we only have so many years that we live.
Yep.
So whoever we're gonna hand that torch to, being clear and making sure that torch gets handed in the right time frame.
Yeah. One of the things that always seems really tricky about this process is managing the team. Keeping people focused, balancing the right level of transparency without bringing them on every twist and turn of the roller coaster that comes with some stuff like this. How did you think about that and find that balance?
And I think that really varies the size of your company and how long is the process. And we were unusual that we were very transparent because it was long.
Yeah.
And we were small.
Yeah.
And so I thought the biggest risk to losing people and not staying focused was a lot of uncertainty of what's happening. But you got to remember, like, we did a process and it didn't go through.
Yeah.
And then we did another process. So, there's an art to managing things. And and that's the roller coaster. Whenever you hit a dip, there's still good things. And that's why the multiple balls in the air of like, if that falls, well, we've got these other good things to go do.
Yeah.
And it's just refocusing and getting energy. And it's, sometimes I felt like a cat on my 15th life, but it's like, let's go.
Yeah. Just keep holding on.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, then nobody else is going to be doing that.
Yeah. That's the founder's job. Hold on harder and show everybody else out. Did you, in that process that did not complete in an did not end in an acquisition, did you bring, you were transparent with the team along that whole process too?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you were all in it together.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's unusual. Most of the time you have a small team that can handle it, and everything else just functions as normal.
Yeah.
But I just didn't think that was the right thing for us.
Yeah. I'm glad that worked out and worked out again the right way after. I'm sure you built a lot of trust in that, though I'm sure it was a hard time. So you said how did the licensing sort of inflection point tie into the acquisition? I know you said that the trigger on the acquirer's side was the sort of the need to show innovation and a leadership change. Was there anything on your side or like company maturity that made you be like, now's the right time?
So we had 2 licenses come in, so that was definitely a much, those are value add milestones. But I think we would have ran the first process anyway, because it helped us get that first one. So I guess the moral to my story is when things don't go exactly like you want them, other good things can come out of it.
So the first process, you had no licensing agreements?
Right.
Okay.
It was imminent, and we were trying to see if that licensor would flip into a buyer.
Okay.
And it's a bit of a risky strategy because who wants to sign this big agreement with people, might be other people there. Yeah. But we were very thoughtful. We thought that was the right thing to do, and we would do it again.
And by the time you actually sold, you had 2 licenses?
Uh-huh.
And that is, so if I understand the business model correctly here, there's like you spent 10 years sort of slowly like commercializing, expanding this technology, proving it out, getting approvals, running pilots, proof of concepts, more customers, more contracts, all in service of getting these big licensing agreements that's where the cash flow comes in.
Right.
And for a very long time horizon, right?
Right.
How much can you talk about sort of what the characteristics of that licensing agreement, or one of them maybe in abstract?
We were very thoughtful of how we thought about our intellectual property and the extensions that we could do. Yeah. So it was really the life of what potential patents were. Okay. So, you're looking at decades. Wow.
So you have an agreement with somebody that you're like, we know we're going to get X% of their sales for decades. And in selling that company, you're actually selling sort of not just the cash flow of that licensing agreement, but the sort of, the third, the fourth, the fifth.
The ability to replicate.
And so you're kind of underwriting like the agreements that exist, the other ones that might exist, the other ways that the acquirer can use the technology, and saying just like, just pay me out a lump sum for the company from here. And now they own the IP, they own the everything.
Right.
That's awesome. That's it. It's interesting. It's very unique. I mean, as tech as this is, it's distinct from most of the like consumer tech deals you hear about, where it's like you're acquiring, the team very specifically, or the product or the user base. Like this is, cash flows. And what happens with the team when it gets acquired? Like, did you work for the acquirer at all?
I did. Throughout the rest of the year, and then I had a consulting agreement, and then they kept everybody. And the site still is in Lenexa, Kansas, is one of their sites. There was something else you said that I was gonna, but I've lost it.
I said too much. Licensing agreements, cash flows, like 3, 4, 5. Other applications within the acquirer.
It's gone. I think it was really good too.
We can wait.
Yeah.
This is a question that I feel like you might have a good answer to. What are some facts or stats that everyone in your industry knows that would blow normal people's minds?
Well, for the grants, I think certainly the $3 billion amount.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
On the acquisition, I think about a third plan to exit through an acquirer, and 10 to 20% do. So when you ask the question of like, are these the same people? Really getting the grant is early stage. You're in your first year or two of life, and planning for it, it's a couple of years before. So somewhere north of 5 years, but I think they're two really important things that we need.
Yeah.
So if I could go back in time and have somebody walk with me, those are the areas, and that's why I'm doing those are my programs.
Yeah.
I remember what I could say. I don't know if you want to
bring it
this
up.
back, but so Orbis was definitely a strategic acquisition. There were not the traditional multiples, and so that's why it's a harder, longer mountain to climb, but a very important one because it was important technology that we wanted to bring in the world, and we knew our place of what role we wanted to have in that, and handing the torch to somebody else who had we weren't interested in building tons of stainless steel, but we know people because that's not where we thought our value really was. We were more in the intellectual property building side of things and the demonstrating that it can be done.
Yeah, so you built just enough with the technology of a lab to show what somebody who already had all the infrastructure, the value that they could get out of it. And you just had to sort of go through the process of 10 years of de-risking your IP.
Right.
And showing them the value of it and the applications of it. And that's when it sort of flipped and
get it into a home with bigger business development teams, bigger formulation teams, bigger commercialization and quality.
So how much do you know about what has sort of been done with that technology since it was acquired?
It I don't know if I want to put that in there, but time moves on,
Yeah.
And
yeah. I mean, is it being expanded to all the other drugs and techniques and stuff that you had expected it would? And gone on to do all the good of the the life saving, stopping the pill cutting, and
things are still advancing.
Okay, I know it hasn't been too long.
Yeah,
year and a half maybe.
And we're still hopeful on a lot more products that market that will have Orbis beads in there.
Cool, that's interesting. How far can the technology go? Can I take 10 years of multivitamins?
Oh, oral, it passes through you, so
no.
24 hours. But injectable, a year or more.
Wow.
And so it's all compliance. How do you make it easier for people to stick with a regimen?
Yeah.
Not have side effects.
And I imagine there's so many applications that I can imagine that are very, very cool for this.
I think there's more applications than what we've explored.
Yeah.
Because you think if it's a really tight range that you can get that.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, you could imagine, you could test for deficiencies and inject a very slow sort of different compounds that rebalance you, that degrade, I don't know, what's the word, degrade, decompose, enter your bloodstream very slowly over a long period of time. It is a little heartbreaking to think about all of the applications that might exist. And as you said, gum and agriculture and any other technologies that, because this IP is owned by one company that happens to be a pharmaceutical company, that it might not enter the market. Or what happens to an IP like that? Does it get sort of fragmented by market? Do they own it just for a specific world of applications? Could we start another company that takes it in a different direction?
So they own it exclusively.
Okay.
But they, in the future, if they wanted to
sub-license, they could.
Typically, though, people don't like to do that because in the drug space, if it's a new drug, there's multi-billion invested in that.
Yeah. And
if you're on the same process as somebody over there and they have a problem, that contaminates what you're doing. So you'd rather draw, if it's financially viable, draw a circle around it and own it.
Yeah.
Than have that possibility of somebody else.
Interesting. And that's part of the strategic piece too, I suppose.
Right.
Is, we don't want anybody else messing up the marketability of this drug or our technology or anything like that. Because there's definitely some spillover in some of those.
But that was our, in the beginning, that was our hypothesis. Could we create enough proof of concept for gum that Wrigley would license it, or agrochemical that Monsanto would license it? And so when we had that learning that it was just too much industry specific knowledge that we would need to have. That when we needed to focus. So I would, draw a line between focus and options. If you're too focused, if something bad happens, you don't have anywhere to go. If you have too many options, you're never going to cross the finish line. So like, so we started more on the option because we're testing that hypothesis. And then we learned and we moved on. And I still think that's better than a lot of thinking, because the industry taught us what we needed to know.
Go bang into the walls.
Right.
Yeah. Get the explore, exploit cycle or focus opportunities. Yeah. That's a really interesting one. I mean, this has been so interesting. I think I still hold hope that the technology makes it into the gum industry and that we get everlasting gobstoppers and, permanent flavors of meal gum. Willy Wonka is real and you invented it and we can't have it because you were acquired by a pharmaceutical company, but someday maybe, when the patents expire. I think it's just it's so interesting to go deep on some of the inflection points of a company, right? Like big funding rounds, big grants and acquisitions. And this has been a fascinating conversation. This is so it's outside my normal internet world, but it's a fascinating technology and story. And I thank you for teaching me, and I hope to hear many more stories of founders that you help through these inflection points in the future.
Hey, thank you so much.